Welcome to the 78th episode of Impact Media Presents, as we are counting down our Christmas favorites for Christmas. And today we are featuring number 8 out of 12. And this is a very, very dear friend and someone very special to me, Phyllis Biffle Elmore, author of Quilt of Souls. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Kelly, for having me here, especially on your countdown to Christmas.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So I just want to get started and dig right on in. I am familiar with your story, Quilt of Souls, and it captured me when I first learned about you and was introduced to you by Tiki, my dear friend and sister from Drake. Sister and friend, and she is your cousin. And when she told me your story, and how your grandmother influenced you to write this book. And it's really about, it's like a love story between you and your grandmother. And it
Yeah,
really
absolutely. Yes.
because I also have that same love and very close special relationship with my grandmother, Maxine Collins, and your grandmother's name was Lula.
Yes.
And I just lift them up today. I lift them up as we are here celebrating you becoming a best-selling author, and we just have lots of things to share. So I tell you what, take everyone back to the beginning as you're telling the story about who you are and how you started writing Quilt of Souls and why. And I know it's an incredible story that I believe my viewers need to hear.
Okay. Thank you, Kelly. Well, first of all, Quilt of Souls, a memoir, is a multi-generational memoir. It's a multi-generational story, I should say. And I think many people will be able to relate to it because it strikes so many chords and it covers so many aspects of life that exist even today. I really wanted to write this book, number one, because it was a subtle promise that I made to my grandmother, because I feel that she was not telling me all these stories just so it can go in one ear and out the other, like she would say. But I want to highlight what we really don't talk about a lot, but what actually happened was I want to talk about those grandmothers of the 1870s and 1880s, 1890s who raised their grandchildren who were born in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, particularly as it pertained to the children. For instance, my parents who were born in the 1920s, they left Alabama along with a lot of other blacks. They left Alabama, went north. A lot of them went to Chicago. My parents ended up in Detroit. And when they get there, they find out, the struggle continues. And, a lot of them had hard time getting jobs. By that time, children were being born. So a lot of times, some of those children were sent back south, a child or two.
Yes.
To be raised by these grandmothers who was born in the 1870s and 1880s. And I felt that these grandmothers, they are underrated demographics because you don't hear very much about these grandmothers. And these were some hardworking grandmothers because not only did they raise their children during turbulent times in the South, but they also raised their grandchildren that was sent back to them. And I thought when I was sent south, I thought that I was the only child that was sent to live with grandparents that I had never seen before. But when I started school, it was 40 children in the whole 2-room schoolhouse, a rural schoolhouse. But I would say 80% of my classmates were being raised by their grandparents, or the grandparents was involved significantly in their life. So when I got sent to my grandparents, like I said, I'd never met my grandmother or my grandfather before, and I was 4. And my grandmother was born in 1883, and she was a quilter. But her history, the story of my grandmother is a story in itself because she was the child of slaves, of ex-slaves. My grandmother had 3 siblings that was born maybe 15, 16, 17 years before her were sold in slavery. So my grandmother's mother really thought she was not going to have any other children because these children were taken from
Mm.
her when they were still nursing, according to my grandmother. But
Wow.
see, I was just to go back just a little bit. I was pretty blessed because a lot of elderly people during that era did not like talking about
Oh,
slavery
absolutely.
or talk about anything that transpired in the South. It wasn't until my parents got into their 90s, late 80s, that they began to talk about it. It took all those years. However, my grandmother told me stories continuously about her life story and her parents and
Mhm.
how her siblings were sold in slavery. So I have to equate that was a reason for her telling me those stories because she wanted me to never forget and always remember. So my grandmother, like I said, my grandparents, her parents were actually, if you read the Ella chapter in my book,
Mhm.
Little Souls,
Yes, yes.
it will tell you what happened to her parents and her older sister Ella. They were all destroyed in one night. So my grandmother was left alone. She had no cousins, she had no aunts, uncles. The only thing my grandmother really had was her children and her grandchildren.
Oh,
And
wow.
so when I was sent south, it was meant for me to be sent south. I think that was serendipitous
Yeah.
because somebody needed to hear the stories. And so not only did I grow up in the rural South where there was no running water, no electricity, um, there was no comforts of what I had in Detroit before I left. So that was my life. And not only was I raised by my grandmother, but it was a community of my grandmother's peers who I would sit with, like Miss Jubilee, who's also in the storybook. My grandmother would send me to go and sit with her. Miss Jubilee was born in slavery.
Mm.
So to be able to talk, I've had my publishers, and a couple other interviews that I had. They said, "Wow, you are really fortunate to be able to talk to women and men who are actually slaves." The Jubilee was over 105, and it's a story. She has a story that's one of the most powerful stories in this book.
Wow.
And so I would listen to her talk and how she saw her parents sold in slavery when she was only 4 or 5 years old. So these were the stories that I grew up with. Now the stories that I wasn't actually able to sit there and listen to the elders talk, I would crawl up under the house because down in the country the houses sit off the
Mhm.
concrete block. So I would crawl up under the house and listen to these people talk about slave. They would have so many slave stories. And
Mm.
I thought they were the most amazing stories because, like I said, some of the elders, they had a hard time talking about that, but they would talk to each other
Right.
because they knew each other's experiences. So I would lay up under the house and just be in awe at some of the stories. I would hear about the lynchings. I would hear about what happened with the slave master and how they fooled the slave master, how they would, because a lot of them wasn't able, some of the plantation, they wasn't able to worship God.
Right.
So they would run a tub of water in a silver wash tub, and they would pray in the tub, so the master couldn't
Mm.
hear them. And that was just so their voices would be muffled. It's
Yeah.
just some of the ingenious things that they used to do that was just so amazing. So my grandmother would tell me stories, and one of the things that I remember is we had a slave cemetery about 1,000 feet from where my grandparents' farmhouse. And a couple times my grandmother took me over there. And one time she said something, and I will never forget what she said. But she said, "Child, you see these folks laying here? These are the best stories you ain't never heard."
Mm.
And I remembered that. And that's what propelled me even more to make sure these stories of her life and the lives of these other elderly people, women in the community, that they would always have one to give them a voice because their story, these are the women, these are the people that you really just, their stories you never hear about,
Exactly.
especially the stories of, I have a chapter in there called Cooter. She was a washwoman or laundress, and that's all they did, her and her four sisters did. They washed clothes on their hands and delivered to the whites in town. But my grandmother said that was the most hardest, difficult work that any woman would have to do, because they would pick up the wash from town on Mondays. That same wash was due back in town on Wednesdays. And they
Mm,
would pick up Wednesday's wash, and that wash would be due back on Friday.
mm,
And the whites didn't care whether or not it rained, snowed, sleet. They still wanted their clothes. And they would have to hang them up on the line. These are women washing all day on
mm,
scrub boards, drawing water from the well, boiling the water in big hot black
mm,
pots under
mm.
fire. So, but it's
Wow.
a great story. It's untold stories,
Yes.
and that's why it took me so long to write the book. It took 4 years to write this book. So,
That seems quick considering all of the stories and the historical information. And, I also want to, clue the viewers in as to how you were, in addition to hearing some of them
mhm,
directly,
mhm.
you actually got expertise to learn and how to trace genealogy and things like that. Talk about how that was helpful to you in uncovering and putting all the pieces together in your story, in your family history.
Well, the first thing I wanted to do and I've always wanted to find my grandmother's um, lineage. But back years ago, we didn't have all the DNA and we didn't have the ancestry. But when finally that came around, that's the first thing I did. I delved off into ancestry. I did my DNA, my mother's DNA, and I was able to, excuse me, I was able to trace that lineage through my mother's and my DNA and
Mhm.
trace that maternal line. And then I started discovering her lineage. And that's why myself, and some of my grandmother's family members have connected. And it's been quite a reunion. It's been
Yes.
great. Yes.
I firmly believe, and that's how we met.
Hmm.
I was promoting, a few years ago and continually promoting how important it is for us to know who we are, where we come from, to know our ancestry, to know our lineage, and our genealogy. And you were introduced to me because of that,
Right.
and I am just so excited for you and others who have really made progress in this area to learn, because I think as a part of reparations, I believe
Mhm.
every African American deserves to get support to find out who they are and where we came from. You
Exactly. Exactly.
So
Yes.
many things that were stolen from us, and all of it, you can't even pay for it. There's no way to accommodate for all of the losses monetarily that we
Mhm.
experienced through slavery.
Oh, absolutely.
Knowing
Absolutely.
who we are is such a rich part of us being able to be who we're destined to be, knowing, what stock we came from.
Right.
And that's every Black person that is native, to America and that came
Right.
here.
And it's and another thing, which was one thing that's really special about Quilt of Souls, is my grandmother was a quilter. And see, that's what makes up the stories in the book,
Yeah.
because she only made quilts from out of of people who had passed on. So she
Mm,
wouldn't place any new clothes. So when people would pass on, everybody knew that my grandmother made quilts from from their loved ones who's passed on. So some days people would bring bags and sacks of clothing, and she would sit there in the front yard and
mm,
tell me the story of those people's clothing, how they lived and how they died. Some
right.
tragic stories. My grandmother's Ella's wedding dress is in my quilt of souls.
Mm,
So each quilt tells a story, just like each chapter of my book
mm,
is based on the clothing, that person's clothing that's going into the quilt. So each chapter tells a story, a powerful story of who these people were. And because Black women used to quilt, that was their catharsis.
yes.
They quilted, because I would look at them sometimes sitting in my grandmother's front yard, and they would be sitting around the quilting horse, and they would be sewing and they would be telling stories. And this was their way of expressing a
Yeah.
lot of the sorrow that had happened in their lives. And it was a lot. And it was something about their eyes. That's something I always noticed. There was so much strength in their eyes, but then there you could see the hurt and the sorrow.
Yes.
And quilting was their way of overcoming.
So was writing your way of
Yes, it was. Yeah, because it brought back memories of my grandmother. Some of the stories, and I've told this to people several times, a couple of the chapters were really, really difficult to write because I was reliving it as
yeah,
my grandmother told them to me. Because some of the stories were, even as a little kid, listening to them, because people say, "How did you listen to those stories?
yes.
And remember them so well?" And I said, "I tell you what, I bet you the first story I heard when I went to school was the Three Little Bears and the Three Pigs and Little Black Sambo.
Mm,
And I can recall the story just like they told it to me yesterday. These stories I could recall even better because they were so powerful.
yes.
And they told a story over and over and over. Elderly people do that. My grandmother died at 105, and she was 100 when she told me to sit on her bed. She wanted me to she wanted to tell me the story of her sister Ella again. So the stories, she told the stories until they became rote. It was almost like I can just see them like a movie reel in my head.
Mm,
I never forgot. Just like I tell in the preface of my book, I may have forgotten the first time I rode a bike, received my first kiss, but I never forgot the stories from the Quilt of Souls ever.
yes. Yes. And storytelling is so powerful. And that's
It is.
one of the reasons I created Impact Media, because I believe we needed to uplift more of our true stories, more of our positive and uplifting stories that
Mm-hmm. Yes.
with who we are, but then also tells the world, gives the world a better and more holistic narrative of who we are, because um, we know that we're being stereotyped and not really being seen and viewed in our full humanity,
Right.
the full essence of who we are as a people. And
Mhm.
we need to take control of the stories and the narrative that are being told about us. And
Right.
we need to have these stories uplifted on every platform and format, in books, and
Yeah.
then made
Do.
into films, and I'm so glad that Till has finally been made into
Finally. Finally.
and it was so beautifully done.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
like some of the hard stories that are in your book, and people are saying they're afraid to see Till. It's like, no,
No.
when they're told well, even though they may be painful, you know,
Right.
it still enriches us in a way,
That's
and
right.
completes us in a way that we can't if we don't know our history and don't know the stories.
Exactly. And people need to actually, I think DNA, I think every Black person should have their DNA done.
Yeah.
Because, say, for instance, the movie Woman King, a lot
Yes.
of people don't know that Dahomey is been in Togo. I have 19% been in Togo.
Oh wow.
That is Dahomey. They renamed it years ago from Dahomey to Benin Togo.
Wow.
So, and a lot of people, when I say that, people say, "Oh wow, I didn't know that. I need to get
Yeah,
my
I didn't
DNA."
know that either.
Yeah, it is. Yep. If you go and you look at Dahomey, it will tell you that it was renamed to Benin. And
Wow.
Togo is like the city on the other side of, yeah.
Yeah.
But that's what that is. And and the people, even though you had a lot of elderly people who wouldn't talk, but at one point in our culture, storytelling and passing down oral history was
Yes.
that happened quite a bit. And somehow that got lost along the way. Because
Yes.
the oral history is not passed down like it used to, and we need to get back to that.
Absolutely.
Because, like my grandmother, um, I'm gonna get off into her head. What I really think she was saying was that you have to capture the stories of your elderly people while they're alive, because once
Absolutely.
they're gone, they're
Exactly.
gone. It's nothing else you can find. The story goes with them. All
Exactly.
those beautiful stories, all those stories that's part of your history, that
Yes.
you will never be able to know is gone. Is gone.
I want to share with you. Doug Galloway said, "Thank you for doing what so many of us missed out on."
Oh, tell him thank you. Yes, and tell him to get with his elderly people
That's right.
and get the story. You'll be amazed the stories that he will find out.
Yes. And I know that faith is a big part of your journey and your grandmother's. And I want to hear a little bit about your faith story before we wind things down.
Oh,
Tell us how your faith sustained you on your journey and your grandma, too.
well, my grandmother set that faith foundation for me. I mean, she was such a spiritual person. I mean, a very spiritual person. And I used to love it when she used to start talking, and then she would roll into a hymn, a old, and then
Yeah.
she would pick back up on the conversation. But my grandmother was what I'm going to say faith filled, and she's the one that showed me. Now, my grandparents couldn't read. My grandmother and grandfather, they wrote a little bit. They could sign their name, but they knew the Bible. And that's so amazing because I would sit there and I would read Bible verses. And what was really important is a chapter in the Bible. I can't remember what chapter or what where that's at in the Bible, but I used to sit and read about who so and so begat so and so and so begat so. That's our genealogy.
Yeah.
That was very important for them to hear that. And
Yeah.
sometimes I would get so tired, and she would say, "Nope, you have to go back and lick the calf over because you didn't, you missed something." So they had that memorized, but that tells you they believed in genealogy and ancestry,
Yeah.
history. But my faith only grew with being around my grandmother. So all the things that happened to me in my life after I left my grandmother, the foundation had already been set. It had been solidified because she put that, and those other elderly women, they were so faith filled and they brought me up.
Yes.
And that's how I made it through life. That's
Absolutely.
how I made it through life. So my faith journey is, if it wasn't for God, I wouldn't be here, and I
Yes.
wouldn't be able to write this book because it was certain times I just wanted to give up because
Yes.
editing process is really brutal. But
Hmm.
my faith is what kept me going. And I could feel my grandma, those ancestors lifting me up and say, "You're going to continue this."
Absolutely. Your cousin, Latanya Tiki Johnson, said, "So
Okay.
excited for these stories to be shared with the world." And she said, "Genealogy is also in the book of Matthew."
Oh, okay. There it is. I knew I was going to say Matthew, but I knew Tiki would know.
That's right. Thank you for being with us today, Tiki. Thank you for making this
Yeah.
introduction during the pandemic in 2020. As we've all been working on trying to figure out, our ancestry lineage
Right.
and telling our stories
Right.
of our family stories and getting in touch with that. This has
Yeah.
really been wonderful. So, Phyllis, in closing, share whatever you want to share about yourself, the book. We want to make sure people know the best place to get the book, where you want people to buy, and how to continue to follow you and Quilt of Souls. As we see, the website has been scrolling the whole time, www.thequiltofsouls.com.
Right.
Uh, so I'll let you share some closing
Yes,
remarks.
you can actually purchase the book on my website, or you can go to Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Target, Walmart. All the major outlets have the book. Both, and it's also available in ebook too. So you can order either the hardback or the ebook um, version of it. So it's available. All you have to do is
Yes,
go get it. But it's a necessary book, a book that needed to be written because these are the women who were behind the Harriet Tubmans and the Mary McLeod Bethunes, and
yes,
these are the type of women that you never hear about that lifted them up.
absolutely.
And these are the grandmothers. The
Right.
grandmothers are those babies that was born in the 50s and 40s and 50s, and they were raised by their grandparents. And the story need to be told because that's a story you really don't hear about very often, as well as the quilters. of that era, the African American quilters. They made amazing quilts, and there's a whole nother episode that you have to do, just the role that quilts played in slavery.
Yes, and we can do that. This is just, this is one segment. There's
Okay.
many parts of the story, to be told. And I
Yes.
just had to celebrate you as one of my 12 Christmas favorites. I'm so proud of you and all that you've accomplished in the past 2 years, getting the book published November 8th, and just, now it's available for distribution. So you knew I wanted to be a part, of this journey in uplifting you, your story, your book, and all that you do. So thank you for making time to spend with me today in this holiday season that we're in. And I know that you have a very, very busy schedule. And I'll let the viewers know, and you can tell them a little bit more if you like. And you're going to be going on tour more in March.
Right. Yes.
Look for
in New York and Texas. And my website will be updated shortly, sometime in January, to reflect all the dates that I'll be in various cities. So if you're available, or I have a lot of virtual online podcasts coming up. One is at the Atlanta History Center, the MLK Center, I call it, and the ALSAH. That's another virtual virtual public. Oh, gee, that's another. I will be there virtually sometime in February. A lot of February events for Black History Week. And my husband brought me something else. The name of the book, everybody should know by now. Quilt of Souls.
That's right. That's right. Thank you so much. You have a wonderful, wonderful holiday season. Thank you for making my Christmas special.
Okay.
It has been a blessing. I love you and the work that you do, and I can't wait to see what else is to come.
Okay, love you too.
We're just getting started on this journey with Quilt of Souls with your new publisher, and I just know you're going to touch the hearts and souls of America and internationally. But and hopefully, I believe it's going to play a part in the healing of our souls. And thank you so much for who you are.
Thank you, Kelly, for allowing me to be here.
Absolutely.
Love you.
Love you too. Take good care.
Okay.
Thank you so much for joining us today. This 8th Christmas favorite is definitely near and dear to my heart. It's so important that we know who we are and where we come from. And I thank Phyllis and her book, Quilt of Souls, for telling our stories that need to be told. Those unsung grandmothers, great-grandmothers, great-grandmothers, great-great-grandmothers that some of us did not have an opportunity to meet, and she's captured those stories. So thank you so much. Everyone, enjoy. We have 4 more Christmas specials in the next few days, so stay tuned, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Take good care, and happy holidays.